Somewhere over western Iraq, a man is flying in the wrong direction. His radio crackles with routine check-ins from controllers who believe he is running a standard navigation exercise, and he answers them calmly, his voice stripped of anything that might betray the fact that he has already decided to steal the most classified aircraft in the Soviet arsenal. On the ground below, his wife and 2 children are crossing a border under forged names, carried by documents manufactured in a basement in Tel Aviv. And in a control room in northern Israel, a team of radar operators watches a single blip crawling across their screens, waiting for a transmission that will confirm whether years of patience have paid off or collapsed into catastrophe. None of these people can reach each other, none of them can turn back, and none of them know whether the others are still alive. There is no abort procedure. This channel exists to show how power is actually exercised behind the scenes. If that's useful to you, you'll want to be here. The aircraft Munir Redfa was flying that morning had never been touched by Western hands. Not once. The MiG-21 was the Soviet Union's crown achievement in interceptor design, born inside the Mikoyan Gurevich Bureau under conditions of secrecy that rivaled nuclear weapons programs. Engineers working under relentless pressure had delivered a machine capable of exceeding Mach 2, climbing faster than anything NATO could field, and operating from rough airstrips that would cripple more delicate Western fighters. Moscow exported the aircraft to Allied nations but controlled every airframe with obsessive precision. Soviet technicians supervised maintenance. Soviet advisors dictated doctrine. Soviet security officers monitored the pilots trusted to fly them. The message was unmistakable. This technology belongs to us. You are borrowing it. And yet by 1965, these delta-winged interceptors were multiplying across Egyptian, Syrian, and Iraqi air bases, flown by Arab pilots, preparing for a conflict that Israeli planners could see gathering but could not yet survive. The problem facing Israel was not courage. Israeli pilots were among the finest anywhere. The problem was blindness. They had never seen a MiG-21 up close, never measured the turning radius that satellite photographs could not reveal, never tested the blind spots in its canopy or the handling quirks that only a cockpit could confirm. Every tactical simulation they ran was built on guesswork, and guesswork kills fighter pilots faster than inferior equipment ever could. Israeli Air Force commanders understood with cold clarity that the next war would be decided in its opening hours, and those hours would belong to whoever owned the sky. Without knowing exactly what the MiG-21 could do and where it failed, air superiority was a coin toss with national survival as the wager. Meir Amit, the director of Mossad, made the decision that would define everything that followed. Israel would not settle for photographs, would not bribe a technician for maintenance logs, would not accept the scraps that conventional espionage could provide. Israel would take the entire aircraft, intact and flyable, delivered to an Israeli runway by the man sitting in its cockpit. The question was how you convince a pilot to betray his country, his uniform, and the superpower standing behind both. The answer, as it almost always is in intelligence, was not technology or ideology. It was disappointment. Mossad officers stationed across 3 continents had spent years compiling dossiers on every pilot known to fly Soviet equipment in hostile nations. Hundreds of names filtered through a targeting methodology designed to identify not political dissidents but emotionally fractured professionals. Promotion records cross-referenced with family backgrounds. Disciplinary files matched against romantic entanglements and financial pressures. The officers running this collection understood that ideology rarely breaks cleanly enough to exploit. What breaks is something more personal. The accumulation of slights that turns loyalty into performance. The slow realization that dedication will never be reciprocated by a system that values bloodline over ability. Munir Redfa's file carried exactly this signature. Born in 1934 to an Assyrian Christian family in northern Iraq, he had given his country everything it asked and more. He excelled in military flight school, earned the respect of instructors who had no reason to favor him, and accumulated more hours in the MiG-21 than nearly any other pilot in the Iraqi Air Force. He was, by every objective measure, one of the most capable aviators Iraq possessed. And it made no difference. The Iraqi military operated according to sectarian arithmetic that was never written into regulations but never violated in practice. Sunni officers from established families advanced regardless of competence. Christian officers, no matter how gifted, reached ceilings that no performance review could shatter. Redfah watched colleagues with half his ability receive the promotions he had earned, and he absorbed each humiliation in silence because silence was the only response available to a minority navigating a system built to remind him of his subordination. His personal life reinforced the pattern. He had pursued a woman whose family rejected the match on grounds that mixed religious prejudice with social calculation, a rejection that carried the institutional weight of a culture telling him he would never fully belong. Each wound was small enough to survive individually. Together, they formed the fracture line that Mossad had been trained to detect. The approach came with the patience that distinguishes intelligence craft from provocation. An intermediary, a businessman whose connections threaded through Iraqi social networks and terminated in a Mossad handler's secure file, made contact at a gathering in Baghdad. The conversation was unremarkable. Two men discussing the frustrations that accumulate in any professional life. But the questions were surgical, calibrated to open channels Redfah had sealed shut years earlier. Subsequent meetings deepened the relationship through careful repetition of the same dynamic. The businessman never mentioned Israel, never suggested anything illegal. He simply listened with a quality of attention that Redfah had never experienced from anyone in a position to act on what they heard. By early 1966, Mossad assessed that the groundwork was sufficient for direct contact. A case officer traveling under diplomatic cover arranged a private meeting and laid out the proposal without ambiguity. Deliver the MiG-21 to Israel. In exchange, receive financial security for life, a new identity, and permanent safe haven. Redfah did not accept. He asked for time, and Mossad granted it without pressure, understanding that the margin between a recruited asset and a dead operation often depends on whether the target is allowed to reach the conclusion himself. Weeks of silence followed before word returned through the intermediary chain. Redfah would do it, but only under one absolute condition. His family must be extracted from Iraq before the flight. This demand transformed an already extraordinary operation into something bordering on logistical madness. Stealing a fighter jet required precision and nerve. Simultaneously smuggling a woman and children across hostile borders using forged papers and bribed officials while Iraqi security services maintained surveillance networks throughout Baghdad required an entirely separate architecture running in parallel with zero tolerance for timing errors. If Redfah flew before his family cleared the border, Iraqi intelligence would seize them. If the family moved too early and their absence triggered investigation, Redfah would never reach the cockpit. Mossad planners built two synchronized tracks. One team mapped the defection flight, calculating fuel consumption at various altitudes, identifying the precise point where Redfah would need to dive below Iraqi radar coverage, coordinating with Israeli Air Force squadrons who would need to distinguish an incoming MiG from an attacking one. A second team constructed the family extraction, arranging overland passage into Iran through border checkpoints where cash and forged business credentials would substitute for legitimate documents, followed by commercial flights to Europe and then to Israel under yet another layer of manufactured identity. Communication relied on dead drops and coded phrases routed through intermediaries who understood only their own fragment. Every exchange balanced necessity against exposure. A single observed meeting, a misplaced document, an overheard word, and the entire structure would collapse into interrogation rooms and firing squads. Redfah maintained his cover with a discipline that amounted to theatrical performance. He reported for duty, flew routine sorties, drank tea with colleagues who had no idea they were watching a man rehearse his own disappearance. This is the level of detail most public accounts never reach. That's the layer this channel focuses on. By midsummer 1966, the parallel tracks converged. Redfah's wife and children began their westward journey under cover identities that placed them nowhere near a border. In northern Israel, fighter pilots received classified briefings describing an inbound aircraft they were to escort rather than engage. Radar operators along the eastern frontier were ordered to track any fast-moving contact approaching from Iraqi airspace and hold fire until receiving a specific code phrase on a designated frequency. Airfields were cleared, fire crews positioned, and technical teams assembled to receive a machine most of them had encountered only in reconnaissance photographs. The operation passed the threshold where hesitation was still possible. Every asset was committed. Delay now meant exposure. Exposure meant death. August 16, 1966. Redfa arrived at his base before dawn and moved through pre-flight procedures with the mechanical calm of a man who has rehearsed the unthinkable so often it no longer triggers fear. He exchanged routine greetings with ground crew, inspected tail number 721 with the thoroughness expected of a senior pilot, and climbed into the cockpit, carrying nothing that would distinguish this morning from any other. His squadron commander had already submitted paperwork recommending Redfa for a commendation based on the previous quarter's performance reviews. The Tumansky engine ignited with its characteristic whine. The airframe shuddered as turbine blades spun toward operational speed. Redfa received clearance, advanced the throttle, and released brakes. The MiG accelerated down the runway and lifted into air that held no trace of what it was about to witness. For 30 minutes, everything proceeded as filed. Redfa maintained heading, altitude, and the scheduled radio check-ins that told Iraqi controllers he was exactly where he should be. The landscape scrolled beneath him, irrigation channels and desert hardpan stretching toward a horizon he would never see from this altitude again. His pulse climbed as the turnpoint approached. The planned route called for a rightward bank back into Iraqi airspace. Instead, Redfa pushed the control column forward and dove. Altitude vanished in seconds. Terrain features blurred past the canopy as ground clutter swallowed his radar signature and his transponder went silent. Controllers in Baghdad began transmitting with escalating urgency. Redfa killed the radio. He crossed the Jordanian border at near supersonic speed, the compression wave from his passage reaching the ground after he was already miles beyond it. Behind him, Iraqi air defense networks detonated into action. Interceptors scrambled from western bases. Alerts cascaded to every neighboring military command. Redfa pulled up and climbed hard, trading speed for altitude while burning fuel at rates that exceeded his pre-flight calculations. The low-level dash had consumed reserves that could not be recovered. His fuel gauge fell with the steady inevitability of a countdown, and the mathematics were not forgiving. If Israeli escorts failed to find him within minutes, he would flame out over Jordan with no friendly runway in range. He switched to the pre-arranged frequency and transmitted the code phrase. Israeli radar operators had already classified the inbound contact as hostile and were preparing combat intercept. Then the transmission arrived and everything reversed. 2 Mirage fighters already airborne changed course and closed from the west. Redfa spotted them first. 2 silver shapes tightening on his left wing. They took escort positions on either side, and the lead pilot gave a thumbs up through the canopy. That single gesture confirmed what no radio transmission could. His family had made it across. The architecture had held. Ramat David Air Base had been cleared for his arrival. Fire trucks and emergency vehicles lined the taxiway. Officers and engineers crowded the tarmac edge. Redfa joined the landing pattern, lowered gear, and set the MiG down with a single chirp of tires on concrete that had never felt Soviet rubber before. The drag chute billowed behind him. Silence arrived like something solid when the engine wound down to stillness. He climbed from the cockpit on legs that barely held him and stood on Israeli ground for the first time, breathing air that smelled no different from the air over Baghdad, but belonged to a country that had just promised him he would never have to be invisible again. He shook the hand of the officer who reached him first. Behind him, technicians were already circling the aircraft with the focus of surgeons preparing to open a body that held answers to questions no one had been able to ask for a decade. What they discovered inside that airframe over the following months redrew the tactical map of Cold War air combat. Israeli and American engineers disassembled the MiG-21 system by system. The Tumansky engine delivered impressive thrust, but consumed fuel at rates that crippled effective range to barely 200 miles. The radar-designated RP-21 struggled against ground clutter, rendering the aircraft effectively blind in low-altitude engagements. The canopy restricted rearward visibility so severely that pilots could not see threats approaching from behind without ground controller assistance. And the operational documents recovered with the aircraft revealed what no hardware analysis could. Soviet tactical doctrine demanded that pilots follow precise directives from centralized radar controllers rather than exercising independent judgment in combat. Western air forces that prized pilot initiative now understood exactly how to exploit that dependency. Within months, American pilots over Vietnam received updated briefings built on what the stolen MiG exposed. They forced engagements into low-speed turning fights where the delta wings hemorrhaged energy. They attacked from rear quadrants where Soviet-trained pilots could not visually acquire them. They disrupted ground control frequencies, knowing that pilots conditioned to obey would hesitate when the commanding voice disappeared. Kill ratios climbed, the knowledge proliferated through NATO, reshaping fighter training, missile engineering, and aircraft design across the entire Western alliance. Moscow absorbed the blow in stages, first disbelief, then institutional fury, then the grinding work of assessing exactly how much had been compromised. Soviet engineers reviewed every specification and identified vulnerabilities they had to assume were now known to every adversary. Export models were stripped of sensitive systems. Tactical doctrine was rewritten, training programs overhauled. The financial cost of compensating for a single defection rippled through the Soviet military budget for years. Because once you see how this was done, the operation itself stops being the important part. Munir Redfa vanished into Israel under an assumed name and lived quietly for the rest of his life, rarely speaking about what he had done. His children lost their accents and grew into lives indistinguishable from their Israeli-born neighbors. Iraq sentenced him to death in absentia, denouncing him as a coward corrupted by foreign money. The MiG-21 he delivered sits today in an Israeli Air Force museum, its paint weathered, its systems decades obsolete, a relic of a machine that once embodied Soviet technological supremacy. But the aircraft was never really the point. The point was that the most heavily guarded secret in Soviet aviation was surrendered not by a spy or a saboteur, but by a man whose own country spent years convincing him he had nothing worth protecting. And if that is how the most powerful military alliance on Earth lost its most prized weapon, through the quiet, accumulated cruelty of treating a gifted man as less than what he was, the question that should unsettle you is not how Israel pulled it off, but how many Munir Redfas are sitting in cockpits right now, in countries making the same mistake, waiting for someone patient enough to ask.